From the southeastern corner of western North Carolina, this is Folklore. I'm your host, James Hernishan. People keep asking me to make a prediction about the election. I have no idea why. My answer is always the same. I stopped making predictions about elections in 2016, when Donald Trump surprised everyone, including himself, by winning the White House. I did allow myself one easy call this spring, that this election campaign would be extraordinary. I think I nailed that one, although I was referring to the presidential race, not the down-ballot ones. On that note, I want to take advantage of this platform to deal with a few noteworthy issues that I couldn't get to during my interviews with local candidates. By now, I expect most listeners of this podcast will have cast a ballot. First, because Polk County, like the rest of the state of North Carolina and much of the rest of the country, has seen record numbers of early voters. And second, because if you're listening, you're probably the kind of person who, more likely than not, takes your civic duty seriously and wouldn't want to risk the chance of some random event, say another tropical storm of historic proportions, getting in your way of voting on November 5th. Still, I don't think it's too late for an episode that covers some of the developments that slipped through the cracks of my attempt to help to provide something approaching election journalism. I'll begin by explaining why only some of the candidates for local office made it onto Folklore. The simple answer is I invited a long list of them to sit for an interview, and not everyone accepted. Of the two incumbent county commissioners, only Paul Byler took me up on the offer. Myron Yoder, although he agreed in early October to try to find the time, texted me on October 18th that he had, quote, too much going on. And that could be true. 2 days before that, the North Carolina Licensing Board for General Contractors completed a preliminary investigation into a pair of complaints against Commissioner Yoder's construction company and decided that the evidence they examined alleging professional misconduct justifies holding a disciplinary hearing. Given that building inspections are the responsibility of the county, I thought this development was relevant to voters. When I asked Commissioner Yoder about the hearing, he replied that none had been scheduled and pointed out that his contractor's license is current and in good standing. According to the licensing board, there are more than 30,000 general contractors in the state, and about 100 complaints escalate to disciplinary hearings each year. The other Republican no-show on Folklore, Jennifer Hargett, took more than a month to accept my invitation, but she never responded to my request to set a date. She's chosen to keep a curiously low profile overall. Her digital footprint is pretty much non-existent. Even the county GOP has chosen not to fill the void she's left. Its website, for some reason, contains no information about her or any of their local candidates. That leaves a lot of space for gossip to flourish on social media. The whole point of this podcast is to get it straight from the horse's mouth, and I'm not going to repeat anything I've come across secondhand. If she wins a seat on the county commission, it will be a powerful rebuke to the idea that we need robust journalism to keep democracy functioning, at least in small rural counties like ours. So, for me, the Hargett campaign is easily the most interesting. Meanwhile, on the Democratic side of the ticket, Commissioner candidates Ray Gasperson, Libby Morris, and Karen Pack all managed to find the time to sit down for an interview. So did school board candidate Sid Muchler at first, but she failed to turn up at the time and place we'd agreed to record an interview and didn't respond to my offer to reschedule. Earlier this year, I interviewed Sid's opponent for the White Oak seat on the board, the unaffiliated incumbent Cindy Allen, and I did interview both candidates for the only other contested race, the one for Saluta's seat. That would be Rob Parsons and Rick Stitch. Rick Koval is running unopposed for his Tryon seat, so I didn't see much of a point in wasting his time or mine or yours. So that's why I ran interviews with only 4 of the 6 county commissioner candidates and 3 of the 5 school board candidates. But what about the NC House and Senate and the U.S. House races? The Democratic candidate for NC House District 113, Michelle Antelek, did join the Folklore roster, and so did the Republican incumbent Jake Johnson, although that was back on the day that filing for the primaries opened. I wanted to get the NC Senate candidates, incumbent Tim Moffitt and Democratic challenger Chris Walters, on the show, but neither responded to their invitations. Among the 4 candidates for the 2 U.S. House seats, NC 11 and NC 14, only the Democrats, Caleb Rudow and Pam Janant, talked with me. Republicans Chuck Edwards and Tim Moore did not return my calls. Now, I didn't really expect to get Edwards or Moore. I'm actually pleasantly surprised that I got Ruto and Jeanette, but I was particularly disappointed by my failure to talk with Edwards because I've got some questions for him. Since he was elected 2 years ago to replace Madison Cawthorn, Edwards has been a mostly loyal Trump partisan, repeating misleading talking points about the Biden administration and voting more or less the same way Cawthorn did. Edwards hasn't exactly made himself available to the press, let alone a part-time podcaster. So here's an excerpt from a rare town hall he held at Blue Ridge Community College last December. He's answering a question about how we might pay for the cost of helping arm Israel in its fight against Hamas. This comes from WLOS television.
We believe that we can totally offset the funding, the supplemental funding for Israel, if we erase the 87,000 IRS agents that are still scheduled to be hired.
Edwards in line with a big group of congressional Republicans concerned that funds used to ramp up the IRS could hurt hardworking middle Americans. Edwards arguing those funds would be better off helping what he calls America's greatest ally in the Middle East, Israel. How much of that would go towards Israel specifically?
All of that would go towards Israel. It would be pretty much a clean offset.
What's that about 87,000 IRS agents? Well, Edwards is repeating a Trump talking point about how Biden wants to hire that many agents to, quote, harass hardworking Americans. The truth is, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is mostly about jumpstarting the country's shift to renewable energy production, does include $80 billion over 10 years for the IRS. A Treasury Department report estimated that the IRS could hire about 86,000 employees with that kind of money, but many of them would not be auditors, just IT and other administrative staff. And no Americans making less than $400,000 a year would be audited by the new agents. So Biden wasn't about to sic 87,000 auditors on hardworking Americans. That argument was widely and soundly debunked long before Edwards repeated it. By the way, did you notice how the reporter for WLOS also referred to hardworking middle Americans and not the wealthy executives who would actually be targeted by restoring IRS auditing activity to the levels they were before Trump was in office? But I digress. Fast forward 10 months and one tropical storm later, and Edwards suddenly seemed to have found an independent streak. Among his first press releases after Helene had done its worst to our district was one consisting of a remarkable and comprehensive list of facts debunking the myriad falsehoods and conspiracy theories. This was the kind of nonsense that many of his Republican colleagues in Congress and Donald Trump himself were spreading about the federal response to, and in some cases responsibility for, the storm. It was really something to read. I'm sure you've at least heard of it. It got Edwards the kind of attention from national news outlets that rookie members of Congress can usually only dream about. And even diehard Democrats in Polk County were praising him on social media for having the courage to distance himself from the lies that many in his party were spreading. Edwards does deserve credit for calling out the lies, no doubt about it. He was putting space between himself and the disinformation campaign his party was waging. But let's face it, some of that stuff bouncing around the internet was pretty out there. Lithium deposits under Chimney Rock? Seriously? Governor Cooper couldn't get President Biden on the phone? That one was even easier to fact-check out of the ballpark. How much courage does it really take to denounce that kind of thing? And how much space did Edwards put between himself and those spreading the disinformation? To answer that, here he is on October 7th talking with CNBC just before he released his statement.
And Congressman, first of all, thank you for joining us this morning. We know you're on the front lines. We know this is a horrible tragedy, but tell us where things stand right now.
Well, we got off to a slow start with getting assistance in here from our national and state agencies. They are here now in full force. We've seen widespread damage beyond anything these mountains have ever seen. Not only flooding, but trees down, homes destroyed, roads, bridges washed out, major arteries in and out of North Carolina cut off, folks in neighborhoods that we still can't reach, widespread power outages. I believe we still have well north of 100,000 energy customers that do not have power. Sporadic communication. It's really a desperate situation here in the mountains right now.
We mentioned that this is the worst flooding in over a century in that area. Why do you think it's taking so long, and why it's been so hard to get the rescue efforts under control there?
I can't explain why it's taken so long. Those are definitely questions that I'll be asking once we're far enough into this that I feel comfortable in pulling resources aside to begin to ask those questions. It was more than 3 days before we ever saw the first folks in here from FEMA, before we saw the first sign of any significant resources. But we're well underway now. I'll tell you what really encourages me is the way that the mountain people here are pulling together. We see search.
Edwards didn't just manage to slip in criticism of FEMA several times during the interview. His very first statement was a dig at the agency. Here he is 2 days later on CNN.
I sourced tonight a Republican congressman from one of the areas hardest hit by Hurricane Helene. Representative Chuck Edwards of North Carolina is taking it upon himself to try and debunk some of what's being pushed about what's happening in his state. He represents Western North Carolina. And thank you, Congressman, for being here, because I was struck by your post today. And you wrote that you don't think the FEMA response has been perfect, but you said the rumors are just so outrageous that they had to be addressed. And you shoot down that Helene was somehow engineered by the government, that you say FEMA's not stopping trucks and confiscating supplies. The FAA is not restricting airspace from recovery operations. FEMA's not diverting disaster funds to the border, to foreign aid. How much of this were you hearing from your constituents?
Well, the rumors certainly have been growing. Now, I'm not going to defend FEMA's honor. They've made a lot of mistakes. They continue to make a lot of mistakes in our recovery efforts here. But I was simply finding that all of the rumor, the falsities were more getting in the way of us trying to help the people here in Western North Carolina recover from Helene.
Again, his first response is a criticism of FEMA. And by the way, just how fast was FEMA supposed to get to the areas hardest hit by Helene? The first day of flooding took out just about all communications and roads in Western North Carolina. It would have taken at least another day to figure out where emergency response teams were needed the most, and a third to begin deploying them. Complaining about a 3-day delay seems more than a bit uncharitable. So even when Edwards was doing the right thing by calling out disinformation about the storm response, and that was the right thing to do, he was taking cheap shots at disaster response teams, reinforcing the Trump line about government incompetence. Which brings me to the former president. He showed up the other day in Swannanoa, where his motorcade and security detail blocked traffic and delayed the delivery of supplies for storm refugees. Here's what he said at his press conference, with Edwards standing right behind him.
It's quite a scene driving up. You see that kind of destruction. Actually incredible. To see that is incredible. It's the power of nature. Nothing you can do about it, but you got to get a little bit better crew in to do a better job than has been done by the White House. It's been not good. Not good.
The criticism of the White House is almost front and center. I say almost because it's what he said right before launching into his campaign talking points that really reminded me just how unfit he is to hold any office, let alone the presidency. The power of nature. There's nothing you can do about it. But the truth is, Helene was not a natural disaster. It was an unnatural disaster, one that was significantly more powerful and more far-reaching than any in history for this part of the world. It got that way because of how hot we've made the oceans by continuing to pump heat-trapping carbon emissions into the atmosphere. If we all just throw up our hands and say, it is what it is, instead of doing what we can to turn things around, it will happen again. Yet Donald Trump continues to deny the reality of climate change, and he's made support for not doing anything about it a key pillar of his campaign. After what we all just went through, does anyone in North Carolina really think that the climate is okay? That the tens of thousands of scientists who have been warning us for decades that exactly this type of thing would happen are all wrong about what we can and should do about it? I've made a point of sticking to local issues on this podcast, but sometimes local and global events are one and the same. I wish I had the opportunity to discuss this discrepancy between what Congressman Edwards supports and what that support has done to his constituents. I'd like to ask the same questions of North Carolina House Speaker Tim Moore, who is also at Trump's side in Swannanoa, and who is denying that he has been talking with and emailing the White House about the federal response, despite documentation that shows he has been doing just that. I actually did give 5 of the county commissioner candidates the opportunity to address the threat posed by climate change during the candidates forum I moderated on October 15th at the high school. But I was reluctant to stray too far from purely local issues, so I didn't ask them directly, and none of the 5 candidates still on stage at that point, Jennifer Hargett had left early, took the hint. I now regret that decision. What I did was combine several questions about environmental issues from the audience into one question, and let the candidates choose how to answer. To be fair, everyone, both the Republicans and Democrats on the stage, gave thoughtful and intelligent responses. They didn't choose to deal in any substantive way with climate change, but at least they didn't deny any facts. And it's kind of comforting to know that the further you get from the highest office and the closer you get to home in Polk County, the less deceitful the rhetoric from both veteran and hopeful politicians becomes. For me, the stark difference between the tone of local and national politics has been the biggest take-home message of this campaign. I'm going to leave you with one more clip that you may not have heard before. It's from another former president. If you were lucky enough to have electricity and internet at the time, you may have heard another segment from the same October 10th speech, the part criticizing young black men for not being the kind of citizens we should all aspire to be. That speech wasn't primarily about young black men who are reluctant to vote for a woman. Here's a part you probably didn't hear, the part I think was more important.
And it's been one of the most disturbing aspects of this election season about Trump's rise in politics, is how we seem to have set aside the values that people like Dan stood for and Bob stood for and that I was taught, and those didn't used to be Republican Democratic values. I mean, it used to be we'd have arguments about tax policy or foreign policy, but we didn't have arguments about whether you should tell the truth or not. We didn't make excuses for people who just violated basic norms of treating people fairly and with respect. I mean, just last week, I talked about this. We had one of the deadliest hurricanes in American history. The beautiful town of Asheville, North Carolina, one of my favorite places in the country. Spent time there, amazing people, devastated, hundreds of people killed. And President Biden and Vice President Harris were down there meeting with local officials and comforting families, asking how they could help. And Donald Trump at a rally just started making up stories about the Biden administration withholding aid from Republican areas and siphoning off aid to give to undocumented immigrants. Just made the stuff up. Everybody knew it wasn't true. Even local Republicans said it was not true. And now the people of Florida are dealing with another devastating storm. And I want you to watch what happens over the next few days, just like the last time. You're going to have leaders who try to help, and then you have a guy who will just lie about it to score political points, and this has consequences. Because people are afraid, and they've lost everything, and now they're trying to figure out, how do I apply for help? And some of them may be discouraged from getting the help they need. The idea of intentionally trying to deceive people in their most desperate and vulnerable moments. And my question is, when did that become okay? I'm not looking for applause right now. I want to ask Republicans out there, people who are conservative. who didn't vote for me, who didn't agree with me on it. I had friends who disagreed with me on every issue. When did that become okay? Why would we go along with that? I mean, if your coworkers acted like that, they wouldn't be your coworkers very long. If you're in business and somebody you're doing business with just outright lies and manipulates, you stop doing business with them. Even if you had a family member who acted like that, you might still love them, but you tell them you got a problem. And you wouldn't put them in charge of anything. And yet, when Donald Trump lies or cheats or shows utter disregard for our Constitution, when he calls POWs losers or fellow citizens vermin, people make excuses for it. They think it's okay. They think, well, at least he's owning the libs. He's really sticking it to them. It's okay as long as our side wins. And by the way, I'm sorry, gentlemen, I've noticed this especially with some men who seem to think Trump's behavior, the bullying and the putting people down, is a sign of strength. And I am here to tell you that is not what real strength is. It never has been. Real strength is about working hard and carrying a heavy load without complaining. Real strength is about taking responsibility for your actions and telling the truth even when it's inconvenient. Real strength is about helping people who need it and standing up for those who can't always stand up for themselves. That is what we should want for our daughters and for our sons, and that is what I want to see in a president of the United States of America.
I dare you, whatever your political leaning, to find anything in that clip that doesn't ring true. And if you haven't yet voted, keep those words in mind when you do. Because we're not just choosing county commissioners and school board members. We're also choosing members of the state legislature and executive, courts and Congress and a president. And in case you haven't noticed, North Carolina is a swing state again. Trump and Harris are statistically tied, and our 16 electoral college seats could very well make all the difference. Early voting ends at 3 p.m. Saturday, November 2nd. Election Day is November 5th. Thanks for listening.